Blood pooled on the imported Italian marble, but the ruthless boss of the Castiglione family wasn't looking at his own wounds. His cold, deadly eyes were locked on the purple bruises marring his plus-size nurse's soft jaw. "Who hurt you?" he roared. Her whispered answer would ignite a city-wide war. The clandestine clinic beneath the bustling streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side did not officially exist. It had no listing on Google Maps, no glowing neon sign, and no billing department. It was a sterile, state-of-the-art trauma center run by Dr. Arthur Caldwell, a formerly brilliant surgeon from Bellevue Hospital who had lost his license to a prescription pad scandal. Now, he catered exclusively to New York's underworld, offering absolute discretion for an exorbitant price. And Beatrice Hayes was his best trauma nurse. Beatrice was a woman who took up space, and she made no apologies for it. Standing 5'8", she possessed a soft, heavy, unapologetically fat figure that she usually draped in loose navy blue scrubs. In a world populated by razor-thin mob wives and hollow-cheeked hitmen, Beatrice's sturdy, substantial presence was an anomaly. She had heard the whispers, the cruel nicknames muttered by heavily tattooed enforcers in the waiting room, but she never cared. Her steady hands, sharp mind, and absolute refusal to panic under pressure made her indispensable. It was 2:14 a.m. on a suffocatingly humid Tuesday when the clinic's reinforced steel doors blew open. "Caldwell, get the hell out here!" A voice bellowed, frantic and thick with a Brooklyn accent. Beatrice dropped her clipboard and bolted toward the reception area. 3 men in ruined Brioni suits stumbled through the threshold, half carrying, half dragging a 4th man between them. The metallic scent of fresh blood immediately overwhelmed the faint smell of bleach in the corridor. The man bleeding out on the floor was Leonardo Castiglione. Everyone in New York knew the name, even if they had never seen the face. Leo was the newly crowned head of the Castiglione syndicate, a man whose reputation for cold, calculated violence was whispered about from the docks of Red Hook to the penthouses of Tribeca. "Gunshot wounds," Beatrice ordered, her voice cutting through the panicked shouting of the mobsters. "How many?" "3," one of the men gasped, his hands slick with his boss's blood. Chest, shoulder, and leg. It was an ambush on FDR Drive. Fucking automatic weapons. Get him on the gurney. Now, Beatrice commanded. She didn't see a terrifying mafia don. She saw a failing biological system. They hoisted Leonardo onto the stretcher. He was a massive man, broadly built with sharp, patrician features, currently pale from blood loss. As they wheeled him into Trauma Bay 1, Dr. Caldwell rushed in, his eyes widening at the sight of the notorious mob boss. For a split second, the disgraced surgeon froze. The political weight of the man on the table was paralyzing. If Leonardo Castiglione died on their operating table, Caldwell knew they would all be buried under the East River by dawn. "Dr. Hemorrhage control now," Beatrice snapped, breaking Caldwell's trance. She moved with a fluid, surprising grace for a woman of her size. She snipped away Leonardo's ruined 3-piece suit, exposing a broad chest corded with muscle and marred by violently bleeding bullet holes. Beatrice slapped a pressure dressing onto the chest wound, leaning her considerable weight into it to stem the arterial spray. "His pressure is tanking. BP is 70/40, Beatrice called out, expertly establishing a large-bore IV line into his uninjured arm and pushing rapid fluids. "He needs O-2 units immediately." For the next 4 hours, the trauma bay was a battlefield. Beatrice and Caldwell worked in desperate tandem. She anticipated the doctor's every need, passing clamps, suctioning blood, and monitoring Leonardo's erratic heart rate. It was a brutal, grueling surgery. Sweat beaded on Beatrice's forehead, plastering her dark curls to her skin. Her scrubs were soaked in the mob boss's blood. By 6:30 a.m., the bullets were resting in a steel kidney basin, and Leonardo's vitals had stabilized. Caldwell collapsed into a rolling chair, burying his face in his hands. Beatrice merely exhaled, wiped her brow with the back of her forearm, and began the meticulous work of cleaning the patient. It was during this quiet aftermath that Leonardo opened his eyes. They were a striking, piercing amber, like the eyes of a predatory cat, and they locked immediately onto Beatrice. He was heavily sedated, intubated with a nasal cannula, and strapped to a web of monitors. But the sheer force of his presence was suffocating. He tried to sit up, a low, guttural sound tearing from his throat as the freshly sutured wounds stretched. "Hey, no! Put your head down," Beatrice said firmly, placing a soft, plump hand squarely in the center of his uninjured chest and pushing him back onto the mattress. Most men would have recoiled or threatened her for daring to touch them with such authority. Leonardo merely stared at her. His hazy mind tried to process the woman standing over him. She wasn't one of the fragile, surgically enhanced women who usually orbited his world. She was soft, warm, and built like a Renaissance painting, all lush curves and reassuring weight. Her hand on his chest felt like an anchor, pulling him back from the dark abyss he had been drowning in. "Water," he rasped, his voice rough like crushed gravel. Beatrice filled a small cup and held a straw to his lips. "Take it slow, Mr. Castiglione. You lost about half your blood volume tonight. You're not going anywhere for a while." Leonardo drank, his amber eyes never leaving her face. He noted the dark circles under her brown eyes, the blood staining her clothes, and the unflinching, exhausted calm in her posture. "You saved me," he murmured, the words heavy. "Dr. Caldwell performed the extractions," Beatrice replied automatically, checking his IV drip. "Caldwell is a coward," Leonardo said softly, a frighteningly lucid edge returning to his voice. "I saw him freeze. You're the one who pushed the blood. You're the one who kept me here." Beatrice paused, her fingers lingering on the plastic tubing. She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It's my job. Try to sleep." As she turned to leave, a large, blood-stained hand shot out, weakly but firmly wrapping around her thick wrist. His thumb brushed against her pulse point. "What is your name?" the mob boss asked. "Beatrice. Beatrice," he repeated, tasting the syllables. "Don't go far, Beatrice." 2 weeks later, the sterile walls of the underground clinic had been replaced by the opulent, suffocating luxury of the Castiglione estate in Alpine, New Jersey. Leonardo had absolutely refused to stay in Caldwell's underground bunker for his recovery. However, he also refused to leave without the nurse who had kept him tethered to the living. When Beatrice initially declined his offer to become his private, round-the-clock medical concierge, Leonardo didn't threaten her. Instead, his accountant, a sharply dressed man named Silvio, arrived at the clinic with a briefcase containing a cashier's check for $200,000. The exact amount of the crushing medical debt Beatrice's mother had accrued before passing away from cancer the previous year. "It is a 4-week retainer," Silvio had explained smoothly. "Mr. Castiglione insists on the best. He believes you are the best, Miss Hayes." And so Beatrice found herself living in a sprawling, fortified mansion, surrounded by armed guards, high stone walls, and ruthless men. The transition was jarring. The men who guarded Leonardo were rough, hardened criminals who viewed a nurse, especially a plus-size, fiercely independent woman from Queens, with a mixture of suspicion and thinly veiled amusement. On her 3rd day at the estate, Beatrice was in the massive, commercial-grade kitchen, preparing a specific high-protein broth for Leonardo. A high-ranking capo named Lorenzo, a wiry man with a face scarred by knife fights, leaned against the marble island, watching her eat a slice of toast. "You know, sweetheart, the boss usually likes his women with a little less insulation," Lorenzo sneered, gesturing vaguely at Beatrice's wide hips. "Must be weird for him, having a whale floating around his bedroom all day." Beatrice didn't flinch. She slowly set down her knife, her expression flat. "I'm not his woman, Lorenzo. I'm his nurse, And if you don't step aside, I'm going to accidentally spill boiling chicken stock on your very expensive loafers. Is there a problem here?" The voice was quiet, but it commanded the room with the force of a bomb threat. Leonardo stood in the doorway. He was leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane, dressed in loose cashmere sweatpants and a dark t-shirt that barely concealed the bulky bandages beneath. His amber eyes were fixed on Lorenzo with lethal intent. Lorenzo paled instantly, standing up straight. "No, boss. Just making conversation with the nurse." "Get out," Leonardo said softly. "And if I ever hear you speak to Beatrice with anything less than the reverence you show your own mother, I will have your tongue removed. Am I understood?" "Yes, boss." Lorenzo practically sprinted from the room. Beatrice sighed, picking up the tray. "You shouldn't be out of bed, Mr. Castiglione. You're putting unnecessary strain on the femoral sutures. You didn't have to defend me," she added quietly as she walked past him toward his ground-floor master suite. Leonardo followed her slowly, his gaze heavy on her back. "I protect what is mine, Beatrice, and right now you are mine to protect." The words sent an unexpected, dangerous thrill down her spine, but Beatrice pushed it away. She was a professional. He was a mafia boss. There was a line, and she was determined to stay on her side of it. But the line was blurring. Over the next week, they spent hours together in the quiet isolation of his suite. Beatrice changed his dressings, monitored his temperature, and forced him to do his physical therapy exercises. In return, Leonardo watched her. He asked her questions about her life, her mother, her struggles. He didn't mock her size. Instead, he seemed genuinely captivated by it. When she would reach over him to check his blood pressure, his hands would gently settle on her waist, his thumbs reverently stroking the soft curve of her stomach through her scrubs. It was an intoxicating, terrifying dynamic. Beatrice knew she had to step away, just for a moment, to breathe some normal air. On her first official day off, Beatrice requested to drive back to her modest apartment in Astoria, Queens, to pick up more clothes and pay her bills. Leonardo reluctantly agreed, but insisted his driver take her. She arrived at her apartment building just as the sun was setting. The air in Queens was thick with the smell of halal carts and exhaust fumes. She felt a wave of relief washing over her as she unlocked her door, stepping into the familiar, cramped space she called home. She never saw them coming. As she closed the door behind her, two large men stepped out from the shadows of her tiny kitchenette. Before Beatrice could scream, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth, and she was slammed brutally against the wall. "Quiet, piggy," one of the men hissed. He was wearing a dark ski mask, but the expensive cologne and the tailored fit of his jacket gave him away. These weren't street thugs. These were organized hitters. "You've been spending a lot of time at the Castiglione estate," the second man said, stepping into the light. He carried a pair of brass knuckles. "Our boss, Mr. Rossi, is very interested in the layout of the property, specifically the security rotations on the east wing. We know the pig can squeal, so start talking." Damian Rossi, the head of the rival family, the man who had ordered the hit on FDR Drive. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, panic threatening to choke her. But as she looked at the men, the panic crystallized into a stubborn, furious resolve. She thought of Leonardo, lying in his bed, trusting her. She thought of the heavy, protective weight of his hands on her waist. "I'm just a nurse," Beatrice gasped as the hand over her mouth loosened slightly. "I don't know anything about security." "Wrong answer," the man with the brass knuckles growled. The first punch caught her squarely in the jaw. Pain exploded across her face, blinding and white-hot. Beatrice fell hard to the cheap linoleum floor. They didn't hit her again, but the man leaned down, grabbing a handful of her dark curls and pulling her face up. "You have 24 hours to get us the gate codes," he whispered menacingly. "Or next time we don't punch you. We put a bullet in your kneecaps. Tell Castiglione we said hello." They dropped her and slipped out the fire escape, leaving Beatrice trembling and tasting copper on her kitchen floor. The next morning, Beatrice returned to the Alpine estate. She had spent 2 hours in front of her bathroom mirror, applying a heavy layer of MAC foundation and concealer over the angry purple and black bruise blossoming along the right side of her jaw and cheek. She wore a turtleneck scrub top, hoping the high collar would obscure the swelling. She walked into Leonardo's suite, carrying his morning medication. He was sitting in an armchair by the window, reviewing a ledger. He looked up as she entered, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Beatrice, you're back." "I am," she said, keeping her head slightly turned to the left as she approached. "Time for your antibiotics and pain management." Leonardo frowned. His predatory instincts, honed by a lifetime of violence and betrayal, immediately sensed a shift in her aura. She was stiff, her breathing was shallow. "Look at me," he commanded softly. "I need to check your temperature," Beatrice deflected, staring fixedly at the digital thermometer in her hands. "Beatrice," Leonardo said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an undeniable command. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently gripping her chin. She flinched. She couldn't help it. The movement caused a sharp jolt of pain to radiate through her jaw. Leonardo froze. His eyes narrowed, focusing intensely on the heavy makeup covering her skin. With a terrifyingly calm deliberation, he picked up a damp cloth from her medical tray and reached out. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut as he gently wiped the makeup away, revealing the ugly, swollen purple contusion marring her beautiful, soft face. The silence in the room became absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive explosion. When Beatrice finally opened her eyes, the man looking back at her was no longer her recovering patient. He was the monster of the underworld, the devil of New York. His amber eyes were devoid of humanity, filled instead with a violently dark, all-consuming rage. "Who hurt you?" The Mafia Boss roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and vibrating in her bones. Beatrice swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears she refused to shed. She knew what saying the name would mean. It wouldn't just be an assault charge. It would be a slaughter. "Leo, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stood up, ignoring the pain in his own stitched body. He towered over her, his hands gently framing her face as if she were made of spun glass, even as murder radiated from every pore of his body. "Give me the name, Beatrice." Now she closed her eyes. It was Damien Rossi's men. Leonardo dropped his hands. He walked over to his desk, picked up a secure burner phone, and dialed a single digit. "Silvio," Leonardo said, his voice deadly calm, devoid of all emotion. "Call the capos. Tell them the truce is over. We are going to war." The Castiglione estate did not simply wake up. It armed itself. Within 20 minutes of Leonardo's fateful phone call, the sprawling Alpine mansion transformed from a luxurious recovery retreat into a militarized command center. Black armored SUVs tore up the crushed gravel driveway, disgorging heavily armed men in dark tactical gear. The manicured lawns were suddenly patrolled by handlers with aggressive Belgian Malinois dogs. Inside, the grand dining room was repurposed. The mahogany table, which had once hosted state senators and corrupt judges, was now unceremoniously covered with blueprints, city grid maps, and an arsenal of high-caliber weaponry. Beatrice stood near the doorway of the master suite, her arms wrapped tightly around her plush waist, watching the organized chaos unfold. The air was thick with the scent of gun oil, strong espresso, and impending death. She felt a profound, heavy guilt settling in her chest. A war was starting, and the catalyst was the bruised, swollen flesh on her cheek. Leonardo stood at the head of the dining table, surrounded by his top capos, Matteo, a hulking enforcer with a completely shaved head, and Carmine, an older, calculating man who managed the family's unions. Leonardo was ignoring the agonizing pain that must have been radiating from his newly stitched wounds. He wore a crisp, dark dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, his broad shoulders squared and imposing. He was no longer the vulnerable patient bleeding out on Dr. Caldwell's clandestine operating table. He was the apex predator of the New York underworld, and he was currently orchestrating a bloodbath. Rossi's main distribution hub is the warehouse in the meat-packing district, Leonardo commanded, his voice a low, lethal baritone that cut through the murmurs of his lieutenants. Burn it to the ground. I want nothing left but ash. Matteo, take 2 teams to his illicit casino hidden beneath the restaurant in Hell's Kitchen. No survivors among the made men. Spare the civilians, but make sure Rossi knows we are severing his financial arteries. And Damian Rossi's himself, boss? Matteo asked, chambering around into his Glock for emphasis. Damian is mine, Leonardo stated, his amber eyes completely devoid of warmth. Find his exact location. I don't care who you have to bribe, break, or bury. Find him. As the men scattered to execute their brutal orders, Leonardo finally slumped slightly, his hand flying to his ribs as a sharp grimace broke his stoic facade. Beatrice was instantly in motion. She crossed the grand foyer, her sensible nursing clogs practically silent on the marble floor. "You are tearing your sutures," she said, her voice stern, though her hands were incredibly gentle as she grabbed his elbow and guided him back toward the master suite. "They are irrelevant," Leonardo grunted, leaning a fraction of his massive weight against her soft, sturdy frame. "They are not irrelevant to me," Beatrice snapped, pushing him down onto the edge of the California King mattress. "Take off the shirt. Now." He complied, wincing as the fabric pulled away from the heavy gauze pads. Fresh crimson was beginning to bloom across the white bandages on his right side. Beatrice gathered her medical supplies from the bedside table, her hands moving with practiced, methodical precision. She cleaned the seeping wounds, applied fresh antibacterial ointment, and began wrapping a new line of sterile bandages around his thick torso. As she leaned in close, the soft, generous weight of her breasts brushed against his uninjured shoulder. The proximity was intoxicating. Leonardo reached up, his large, calloused hand gently cupping the side of her face, his thumb hovering just millimeters away from the dark purple bruise inflicted by Rossi's men. "I am sorry I brought this violence to your door, Beatrice," he whispered, his voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered emotion. "I should have had an escort follow you into the building. I failed to protect you." Beatrice paused, the roll of bandages clutched tightly in her plump hands. "You didn't do this, Leo. Rossi's men did, and I don't want anyone dying because of me." "They are not dying because of you," Leonardo corrected fiercely, his grip on her jaw firming. "They are dying because they dared to touch what is mine. You are a goddess, Beatrice. You are soft and brilliant and vital. You saved my life, and they treated you like collateral damage. They will learn that my vengeance is absolute." He pulled her down slightly, pressing his lips to her uninjured cheek. The kiss was burning hot, a promise of devastation and devotion intertwined. Beatrice's breath hitched, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribcage. She was a woman who had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to apologize for the space her fat body occupied in a world obsessed with thinness. Yet here, in the arms of the city's most dangerous man, she was worshipped for every curve, every ounce, every inch of her substantial presence. Before the moment could escalate, a sharp knock rattled the heavy oak door. "Boss," Carmine's gravelly voice called out, "we have a problem." Leonardo released Beatrice, his expression instantly hardening back into the mask of a warlord. "Enter." Carmine stepped into the room, his eyes flicking briefly to Beatrice before landing squarely on his boss. Matteo hit the casino. It was empty. The warehouse in the meat-packing district? Cleaned out. Rossi knew we were coming. He pulled his men off the streets. Leonardo's jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. That's impossible. We moved within 20 minutes. It gets worse, Carmine said, stepping closer and lowering his voice. We reviewed the security logs for the estate. Rossi's men knew exactly when Beatrice left yesterday. They knew she didn't have an armed escort inside the building. Someone fed them her schedule. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Leonardo stood up, ignoring Beatrice's protests. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Damian Rossi hadn't just gotten lucky. He had a rat inside the Castiglione house. Who had access to the transportation ledger? Leonardo asked, his voice a deadly, quiet hiss. Only the capos, the gate guards, and… Carmine hesitated, swallowing hard. Lorenzo, Leonardo's amber eyes flared with a demonic light. He remembered Lorenzo in the kitchen, mocking Beatrice's beautiful, lush figure. He remembered the capo's thinly veiled disrespect. The pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. "Bring Lorenzo to the soundproof room in the basement," Leonardo ordered, walking toward the walk-in closet to retrieve a fresh, dark shirt. "And Carmine, make sure he is securely restrained. He is going to explain exactly how much 30 pieces of silver is worth in today's market." The basement of the Alpine estate was a place where nightmares were born. It was entirely soundproofed, lined with thick concrete, and equipped with drains set directly into the floor. Beatrice remained upstairs, locked safely in the master suite, with 2 heavily armed guards stationed outside the door. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her hands trembling. She could not hear the screams from below, but her vivid imagination painted horrifying pictures. Down in the subterranean darkness, Lorenzo was strapped tightly to a heavy steel chair. His expensive suit was torn, his face already bruised from the initial brutal interrogation. Leonardo stood over him, holding a pair of heavy iron pliers. He was moving with slow, terrifying deliberation. "You gave Rossi the nurse," Leonardo stated, not a question, but a damning fact. "Boss, please, I swear to God." Lorenzo sobbed, spitting blood onto the concrete. "Rossi offered me $1 million. He said he just wanted to scare her, to get leverage. I did not know they were going to put hands on her." "You called her a whale," Leonardo whispered, his voice echoing eerily in the damp room. "You looked at a woman who brought me back from the brink of death, a woman whose beauty and grace you could never comprehend, and you sold her to animals." Lorenzo squeezed his eyes shut, hyperventilating. "I am sorry. I will give the money back. I will kill Rossi myself." "No, Lorenzo." "You will not," Leonardo said, his eyes utterly dead. "Because you are going to tell me exactly where Damian Rossi is hiding right now. And if you lie, I will start removing pieces of you until you find the truth." 10 minutes later, Leonardo emerged from the basement. He casually wiped a few flecks of blood from his knuckles with a monogrammed handkerchief. He walked up the grand staircase and immediately issued orders to his waiting men. Lorenzo had sung. Damian Rossi was hiding in a secure, reinforced penthouse suite in Columbus Circle, believing the height and the private security firm he hired would keep him safe from the wrath of the Castiglione family. He was tragically mistaken. "Matteo, gather the heavy assault team. We are going to Manhattan," Leonardo commanded. "Boss, you are injured. You should not be in the field," Carmine protested weakly. "I am the one who brings the sword," Leonardo growled. "Rossi touched my queen. He dies by my hand." The assault on the Columbus Circle penthouse was swift, silent, and overwhelmingly violent. Leonardo and his men disabled the security cameras, bypassed the elevators, and breached the stairwell doors using localized explosives that barely registered as a dull thud in the bustling city below. They swept through the opulent, glass-walled apartment with military efficiency, dropping the hired mercenaries with suppressed weapons. Leonardo kicked open the doors to the master bedroom. Damian Rossi, a slim, sharp-featured man in silk pajamas, scrambled desperately toward a gold-plated revolver sitting on his nightstand. He never made it. Leonardo fired twice. The first bullet shattered the kneecap of his rival, sending the boss crashing to the hardwood floor with a shrieking wail. The second bullet destroyed his right hand, the hand he had likely used to issue the order to hurt Beatrice. Leonardo walked slowly across the room, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floorboards. He looked down at the bleeding, pathetic man writhing at his feet. The glittering skyline of New York City served as a majestic backdrop through the large windows, bearing silent witness to the execution. "Castiglione, wait," Rossi begged, coughing up blood. "We can negotiate. The ports, the unions, you can have it all." "You sent men to beat a defenseless woman," Leonardo said, pointing the smoking barrel of his weapon directly at the forehead of his enemy. "You bruised the face of the woman I love. There are no negotiations, only consequences." He pulled the trigger. The war was over. It was nearly dawn when Leonardo returned to the Alpine estate. The mansion was quiet, the immediate threat extinguished. He walked straight to the master suite and pushed the heavy oak door open. Beatrice was asleep in the armchair by the window, her thick, gorgeous thighs tucked beneath her, her dark curls spilling over her shoulders in a wild halo. The soft click of the door closing woke her. She blinked, her brown eyes adjusting to the dim light. When she saw Leonardo, she gasped, immediately standing up. His clothes were speckled with blood, his face pale with exhaustion, but the manic, violent energy that had consumed him all night was completely gone. "Leo," she breathed, rushing over to him. She did not care about the blood. She reached out her soft, plump hands, resting gently against his chest. "Are you hurt? Did your stitches tear?" Leonardo dropped his cane. It clattered loudly against the floor, but neither of them noticed. He wrapped his massive arms around her thick waist, burying his face into the crook of her neck. He inhaled the sweet, sterile scent of her vanilla soap. "It is done," he murmured into her skin. "Rossi is dead. Lorenzo is dead. No one will ever lay a finger on you again, Beatrice. I swear it on my soul." Beatrice hugged him tightly. The dangerous mob boss survived his enemies, surrendering completely to her. Wow, what an explosive finale. Leo truly burned the city down to protect his plus-size queen, proving that nobody messes with the Castiglione family, especially not Beatrice. If you were captivated by this intense, dark mafia romance and loved seeing a curvy, unapologetic heroine get the fiercely protective love she deserves, please drop a like on this video. Share this story with your friends who crave action-packed romance. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic tales. Whose story should we tell next? Let us know in the comments.